Sitting down for an interview with the University of Iowa's own Ashley Howard. Short intro, Ashley earned a PhD in history from the University of Illinois. She joined the University of Iowa faculty as an assistant professor in 2019. In tandem with her academic work, Howard has a history of sharing her scholarly knowledge outside of traditional campus environments with those with limited access. Her research interests include African American studies in the Midwest, the intersection between race, class, and gender, and the global history of racial violence. Her newest book, Midwest Unrest, 1960s Urban Rebellions and the Black Freedom Movement, analyzes the 1960s race riots as grounded in the way race, class, gender, and region played critical and overlapping roles in defining resistance to racialized oppression. All right. Ashley, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me today.
To start, what drew you to studying this era of urban rebellions and Black history?
Well, I think the first I've always been interested in history and always been interested in African American history, but I think the part that really kind of shifted how I wanted to tell these stories is I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Nebraska, and I didn't see any books or histories that reflected what I knew were kind of the lived experiences of my neighbors, of my family. And so I was really desperate for that type of book. And so that's why I began to research the histories and the stories that seemed that everybody in my community knew, but were never represented in textbooks or other places where people find history.
Your research focuses on several Midwestern cities. Why did you choose those particular cities to focus on?
Well, I mean, the correct scholarly answer is that they represent different parts of the Midwest, right? When we look at Omaha, we have the urban Midwest, towards the west. When we look at Milwaukee, we have a late Great Migration city in the north, and then Cincinnati is a border city, so kind of a little bit southern, a little bit Midwest. That's the official scholarly answer, but the simple one is they were all driving distance from the University of Illinois, which is where I did my dissertation, so I didn't have to spend a ton of money to do research. I could drive my own car, I could find a cheap place to study, but in the end, it really worked out because there are so many common factors in these three cities, and so it really helped me do a regional analysis.
A lot of cities in the Midwest at that time had smaller but rapidly growing black populations because of the Great Migration. How did that change in demographic shape the tensions that eventually led to this unrest, do you think?
The Great Migration is perhaps one of the most important moments in American history, particularly 20th century history. So the first kind of thing is it's not just black people moving to the Midwest, right? It's also large numbers of white Southern people. And so this is really kind of changing the influx. We are seeing folks being able to work for jobs that are often unionized jobs, so they have more money in their pockets. And black people are really the wave of urbanization and how cities kind of weigh heavily in the American imagination. So it is hugely important to how we even conceptualize the United States today. But the problem is this kind of golden era, this moment of opportunity and industrial jobs and all of this, it really only benefited a single generation of laborers in the Midwest, and black people were often the first fired and the last hired. And so this kind of sets up the tension that we'd later see in my book with the urban uprisings.
A lot of people talk about the uprisings in the late 60s in terms of race, but you've written about some deeper structural issues that may have led to these uprisings. How important were class divisions between black communities, working class and middle class, in shaping what was happening during that time?
Class divisions end up being a really large part of my book in kind of unexpected ways. I knew that people who had access to the kind of political frameworks, whether that be the vote or they're part of organizations like labor unions or civic organizations like the NAACP or fraternities and sororities, they had an outlet to kind of agitate for things. What I did not anticipate were that working class people, and these were folks who, had good jobs, were well educated, but they didn't have those same kind of outlets, that those would be the ones who were really kind of leading the forefront of the movement because they were comparing themselves to their white Midwestern peers. And they saw where they could buy homes. They could see the cars that they were driving. And so there's this class component because even with the civil rights movement, it was the access to certain elements that were a middle class lifestyle. and not the working class lifestyle. And really what surprised me about it is the fluidity in which race or class are the kind of most important lens to investigate, because where there were significant differences between tactics and strategies between Black working class Midwesterners and Black middle class Midwesterners, in the aftermath of the uprising, you really see these two groups of people coalesce to really advance their racial objectives, not this kind of bifurcated class objective.
I think I'm going to combine 5 and 7 here about housing. When people think about the urban rebellions, they often focus on civil rights, but housing policy was a huge part of that story. How did policies like the Housing and Urban Development Act of '68 affect those Black neighborhoods on the ground? And in cases like Pruitt-Igoe, St. Louis, what did those projects reveal about the gap between the federal promises of urban renewal and the reality like on the ground?
The story of housing is one that I think is really a particularly unique story to the Midwest. You know, again, you have this kind of influx in people with the Great Migration. Some places like Detroit have almost an 800% increase in Black residents in a few decades. But yet you have this racial restrictions in communities with redlining, which my colleague Colin Gordon and I have been working on a project in Iowa to look at this. And because of the Midwest, their urban areas have the opportunity to expand. So we see a lot of the housing restrictions, redlining restrictions, even in Iowa, that crop up in the aftermath of the Great Migration to be whole subdivisions. So it's not each individual house, people writing a racial covenant, but all the new homes they're building are actually going to be restricted. And so what this means is that Black people moving to the Midwest are kind of given this false hope, this false promise. Yes, you move to the Midwest, there's no Jim Crow, and then they run into the whole things. And so what things like the Fair Housing Act will do in 1968 is that it will open up the availability in the places. But we still see places like the Pruitt-Igoe homes, the Taylor homes in Chicago, other types of public housing products, because of divestment and because of neglect of these properties, we see a concentration of poverty there. And this becomes a way in which to blame Black urban residents for the really lousy conditions that they are inhabiting in, without looking what it means to have the funding taken away from those places, to have people with capital, be it social capital, political capital, actual capital, in these communities. And so once the Black middle class can leave these urban areas, oftentimes you see them fall into disrepair without a great deal of interest in it. And then you add on top of that the 80s and 90s with the urban renewals, and then we see, you know, the rerouting of highways and the strategic investment in condos and other high-end living spaces to the detriment of the working people who had made these cities go.
Do you want to ask number 8?
I'm going to go with number 6 first, since that comes before that. Can you talk about the role of banking practices like redlining and discriminatory lending and reinforcing segregation and inequality in those cities?
Yeah, so one of the ways we really see this coming out is, you know, it challenges the ways that we think about, you know, free market capitalism and the invisible hand, because there's no such thing, right? The market is not just some entity that moves on its own. The entity is being controlled by policies and practices. And so in particular with redlining, we see what was known as the Homeowners Loan Corporation. They would do this assessment of neighborhoods by city, and they would rank them. And they would not want people to give out loans in these kind of neighborhoods that were ranked D. And these almost inevitably were Black neighborhoods. And it's very telling, because when you look at these maps, you see them say, oh, nice old stock homes, brick, you know, solid single-family homes, but inhabited by, quote, Negroes, you know, avoid this area. So those practices, and then banking practices and real estate agency practices, right? If you are looking to buy a home in a particular neighborhood, they may not give you a home loan, which is why Black banks like Jesse Binga's bank in Chicago were so important. And then, of course, real estate agents, right? There are all these stories that I have in the oral histories that I did of people calling who, quote, sounded white when they asked about apartments or homes. And then when they show up and they find out that they're black, they're like, oh, we're so sorry, the apartment was just rented, or, the home was just sold. And so it's this inability to even get ahead. And real estate agents would engage in a practice called steering, which is where they would show only certain families into certain neighborhoods, on both sides of the color line. White families would always be steered to white neighborhoods, and black families would always be steered to black neighborhoods.
I think I already covered 7. Do you want to cover 8 this time?
So back to the rebellions. More specifically, a lot of narratives about the urban rebellions in that time focus heavily on black men. But I'm curious as to what you think of the role of black women in those uprisings.
This was one of the most exciting discoveries in the archive, right? When historians go into the archive, we have an idea of what we might find or what we might write about, but there's always some gem that we didn't anticipate. And, for me, this gem was women. And it shows up in 2 different kinds of ways. So one was in the aftermath of the uprisings. We have sociologists and political scientists and different people going around and interviewing folks and doing basically a sociological study of it. And whereas in places like Detroit, the arrest record for black women was about 10.7% of the people arrested were women, but when they are self-disclosing whether or not they participate in the uprisings, we see numbers as high as 43%. And so there's this disconnect of how people see that they're engaging versus how the state is seeing them engage. And for me, that really broke it open, that people are participating in these uprisings in very uniquely gendered ways. So women are typically looting or out in the streets after the time for them to be arrested has largely been closed off. And so what this means as a scholar is that record, right? Those primary sources that we look, they don't capture women because women aren't getting arrested in the numbers that males are. Also, women are usually engaging in practices that don't look like, quote, riot behavior to the authorities, right? They may be taking stolen goods. They may be acting as lookouts. In Cincinnati, we see black nurses running an underground triage because the idea was if people needed to get patched up and they went to the hospital, they would surely be arrested. But by patching them up themselves, they kind of protected people in their community. The other really unique thing that I came upon was through oral history interviews. And because women had been ignored or had been read as being apolitical, allowing black women to tell their stories, their account, really gave me a sense of that for these black women, it wasn't just about race, it was really a reproductive justice issue. They wanted the opportunity to raise their children without want, without fear, and in a safe, healthy environment.
Can you talk some more about some of those oral histories that you conducted? What was that like?
Oh, it was wild. It was great fun. It's funny because I regularly tell my own graduate students, like, do as I say, not as I do. But I put out ads in newspapers, and people would call me. I gave them my personal cell phone number, which is kind of wild to think about now. And I would meet them where they were. Sometimes it'd be at the senior center. Sometimes it'd be at the library. Sometimes it would be at their homes, and I would just let them tell their stories. I'd ask some kind of pointed questions about participation in their memories, but I wanted to get a sense of who they were as people. And I just got wonderful stories from people who don't make it into the formal records. One, Mr. Mims was telling me about how, he was out in the streets because he was angry at the ways that well-dressed black men and women were treated, protesting in the street, but that he also felt the need to protect his community. And I said, protect them from whom? And he said, from ourselves, right? This idea that there is a risk for people. Another kind of really great story that I had in interviewing people, I was in Milwaukee, and I was interviewing people who participated in the Milwaukee 1967 uprising while Ferguson was on fire after Mike Brown's murder. And to hear the people who participated 50 years prior refer to the people in Missouri as thugs or, or not doing it the right way was really this moment of cognitive dissonance in thinking about how people see their own politics and how they read the politics of the current era very differently.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but from my understanding, this wave of urban rebellions kind of dropped off after '69.
In some ways, and it's how we see urban rebellions. So, violence has been a huge part of the American political landscape, from our country's inception. If we really stop to think about it, the Boston Tea Party is a riot, right? The people are throwing goods against the state to lodge their grievances. But really this moment between 1964 and 1968 is really this moment of concentrated unrest. And 1967 being the peak year with another kind of moment of inflection after Martin Luther King's assassination in April of 1968. What we see happening in the aftermath of 1968 are more localized and small scale, moments of mass protests or civil disturbance or unrest or however we want to frame this. And so this is actually getting localized to schools. So either K through 12 institutions or college settings. And so only about 25% are in the streets at this time, and 43% are in these educational settings. And in these latter ones, again, 68 to 1972, we really only see about 55% of them being Black participants, and that 43+% of them are white participants. And this is often around draft issues, Vietnam War conflict, Students for a Democratic Society, and these types of things. So that kind of moment of Black urban unrest in the cities certainly tapers off. But again, you have these kind of moments of inflection, whether they be in educational settings. There's a lot of prison riots that occur afterwards, most notably Attica in 1971. And then going on throughout the decades, you'll have maybe one or two every 10 years that kind of capture our historical imagination.
Why were they concentrated in educational areas? Was that because of integrated busing between schools, or?
No, oftentimes that is a part of it, but oftentimes young people kind of saw what was happening in their communities, and they saw that uprisings were really effective ways to get change, right? So in the aftermath of the 1966, 1967 unrest, we see job programs, we see recreational opportunities, we see people caring about the opinions and the concerns about African Americans. And so for many young people, they are replicating this. And that's how you see, Black studies in universities, right? Like University of Iowa's Black Studies program came about because of protests, right? We see more Black books in school libraries. We see the removal of racist teachers. That is all part of kind of the landscape in what is happening in the K through 12 settings. And yes, there are some interracial, skirmishes, but because busing doesn't really begin in earnest until the mid-1970s, like this forced integration, the places where we see Black students and white students fighting each other are usually in high schools where there is already a pretty equal proportion of Black and white students early on, or there's that flip, from a predominantly white school to a predominantly Black school, which is also the consequence of people moving and leaving their neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm. How did the state and white supremacist forces frame these uprisings to advance anti-Black policies?
Yeah, lots of different ways. And, something that's really key that I hope the listeners understand and that those who read my book also understand is that uprisings are always political, right? These are never wanton or asocial violence. They are political acts. And we know they are political acts because the way that the state responds. So in so many cases, they're giving concessions, right? They want to keep the peace, and the terms of the peace are that the people participating get things. But there are also savvy politicians who use these events to boost their own political career. So I think perhaps the best example of this is Mayor Henry Meyer in Milwaukee. And Mayor Meyer kind of thought of himself as a Richard Daley in Chicago or Mayor Lindsay in New York. He wanted to be kind of like a big-time American mayor. And so he used this as a springboard for his national political career. And he very much, took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, and he wanted to make an example of how well he, shut it down, and making a claim to the federal government that they needed to invest in cities, because if the federal government didn't invest in cities, more and more of these things would happen. But when we think broader about the historical memory of these events, people are thinking of them as, the depravity of Black people, right? That, oh, they're just a violent people, or they're just people who have, no good reason except for to go out and, quote, tear up their own neighborhoods. Neither of them are farther from the truth. The uprisings didn't come out of nowhere, right? This is after sit-ins failed. This is after elections failed. This is after all the ways in which we participate in politics in this country have failed. And so this becomes an action. But what it is used for then moving forward is this kind of rise of the law and order agenda that we see under Nixon and then kind of carried out through the late 70s and the 80s. So police get more guns, they get more training, Black people are seen as inherently criminal, and so this is the ways that these events, which were political expressions for full inclusion in American society, then get co-opted to punish Black people.
I'm going to do 12 and then you can do 11. On the flip side of that, how did the rebellions change the direction of the Black civil rights movement to like the Black Power movement?
So I think that's an excellent question. And I think one way to kind of understand this is when scholars talk about this era from 1954, 1955 to 1975, they oftentimes refer to it as the Black Freedom Movement. And that is because there are two discrete movements within it. The first is that civil rights struggle, 55 to 1965, and the second, roughly 1965 to 1975. Of course, there's some kind of overlap and bleed between the two movements. But when we think about the civil rights movement, it is this idea that Black people want to have access to great white institutions. They want white children or Black children to go to white schools. They want Black homeowners to buy homes in white neighborhoods, right? They want access to all the things that white Americans have. Whereas Black Power, on the other hand, is the idea that Black people want control over the institutions of their lives. So they want great Black schools in Black communities with Black curriculum. They want Black mayors of majority Black cities. And so I argue in the book that the kind of bridge between these two movements is the urban rebellions, because the things that Black people are asking for are control or oversight of the institutions in their lives, whether that be police review boards, whether that be a tenants union in these public housing projects. All of these are a way to say we want control over the institutions of our lives, but we don't want a wholesale dismantling of those institutions.
In some cases, after the uprisings had happened, white flight accelerated. Do you think that the rebellions themselves caused that shift, or do you think it's a symptom of something that was already underway?
I think it's a symptom of something that was already underway but exacerbated by these conditions. And I think it's important to note, right, that white people and Black people in the urban North are far more segregated than Black and white people are in the South, right? Even in the urban South. There's far more. So that is always there. But what the uprisings allowed to happen is the structural and economic justification to allow that type of flight to happen, right? So we see, major industries are deindustrializing in the Midwest, and they're going from vertical integration where you kill the cow, you bring the cows, you kill the cows, you turn them into steaks, and then you sell them, to being horizontal organizations. So you hold the cows at one place, and then you move them to another place to butcher them, and then you move them to a third place, right? And those types of jobs leave the cities and move to suburbs and oftentimes exurbs, like places outside. So that's the first thing that happens. The second thing that happens is that the financial institutions make it impossible to maintain businesses in Black communities. And that is that they will not give people insurance in certain communities, and they will not cover homes or businesses in the event of a riot. And so it becomes a bad financial decision to start a business or to own a store or to do any type of economic engagement in the Black neighborhoods of a community. And so that really kind of hastens the white flight. But we also see, right, when the public good becomes something that is accessible to the entirety of the public and not just the white public. So think of schools, think of swimming pools, think of libraries, think of all these things. People want to move to communities which are homogenous, right? So they're like, yes, let's integrate the schools so long as those kids don't have to go to school with my kids. And so what we see in the aftermath of Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which says we should integrate at all deliberate speed, right? All deliberate speed means as fast as you want to go, which for many communities was very, very slow. And then they made new laws which said that you could not bus across district lines. So like places like my hometown of Omaha, they created District 66, which is smack dab in the middle of the city. But because it was its own district, Black kids could not be bused into that school district and white kids could not be bused out of it. So those were kind of all of the workarounds in which even if people did not flee in this kind of motion of white flight, it still maintained those racial boundaries legally within an urban community.
When you look at contemporary debates about policing and housing and inequality, do you see any echoes of the late 1960s today?
I do. And I think it becomes critical to remember that while there are echoes, it is not the same song. And that, you know, the way that these institutions have worked, you know, since our nation's founding, are to give opportunity and privileges to some groups and disadvantages and disincentives to other groups. And so we very much see that. But in the case of policing, right, we have seen that, you know, African American communities and other racial and gender and, you know, economic minorities have been over policed, right? They have more engagement with police than other communities do. But one kind of key shift that we see in the aftermath of the Black Freedom Movement is the rise of hyper-incarceration, right? There are more people incarcerated today than we ever saw before. And this is largely because of, you know, the criminalizing of drug use, right, with the Rockefeller laws. So there's certainly that overview, but we always have to remember that there is this negotiation between protests and trying to bring about a change or, you know, a progressive way forward, and then the people who hold on to that power imagine other ways of kind of drawing it back, imagine other ways of, you know, sidestepping the law. And so we very much see this again with white flight, with the ways that districting are looking, and then also just the ways in which we are conceptualizing these struggles. I think what is really key in the modern era is this notion of, you know, it's a sociological concept of colorblind racism, right? That you isolate the past with, you know, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, well, it's all well and good. We don't have to think about those things. That was the past. And if there are any accusations of discrimination now, well, that's on you because we fixed racism. And so people can ignore the kind of sneaky, insidious ways that this still comes up in our culture today.
And here at the University of Iowa, the university recently moved to close down the African American Studies program and the Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies program by July. How do you think this is going to affect research on Black history and culture like the one that you've been doing?
I mean, it's devastating, and unfortunately, it is just one puzzle piece in a larger, you know, context, right? We also have our beloved State Historical Society in Iowa City, which they closed down the Centennial Building. So that makes it harder to do research, and not just research on Black Iowans, research on Iowans, period, right? Like the flagship university no longer has access to that top-notch institution. And, it will forever be heartbreaking to me. I think the loss of those two departments is really a tremendous setback for the university and the education of our students here and the support of our faculty and our community. But one thing that I think is really always important to remember is that Black studies as a discipline is 60 years old. But the study of Black people, right, centering their literature, their history, their artistic expression, their ways of being in this world, that is as old as Black people in this nation, right? And it really came to the head with Carter G. Woodson in 1926. And for me, I think that's really instructive of a way forward. Carter G. Woodson imagined the study of Black people, all the places where people gather. So there were groups in church, there were groups in barbershops, there were groups in after-school programs, there were groups in fraternities and lodges and sororities. And so while our institutional presence is vital, and that loss is one that I think will have an impact on the university for years to come, those of us who are committed to this field of study, those of the students who are interested in those types of classes and that kind of a new way of thinking and processing that information will always, always, always have the opportunity to do so here at the University of Iowa.
I'll do the last one. For listeners that want to learn more about this history and these subjects, what are 3 books you'd recommend?
Oh, well, I mean, you got to come onto a radio show and promote your own book. So Midwest Unrest is top on the list, but I'll give that to you all as a freebie. So I love Jean Theo Harris's book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, which looks at the myths that we tell around the civil rights movement and why we tell those myths. I think that's a really, really great book. I think there are some really lovely, lovely books about the Midwest. There's one with an organization that I'm a part of called Black in the Middle, which is an anthology on the Black Midwest. And so really thinking about the experiences of people of African descent who are here and who live here. And I also encourage you all, and it's not a book, but I'll put the plug in anyhow, is to read the Annals of Iowa. This is another, just a gem of a resource. I cannot tell you how lucky our state is to have this top-notch scholarly journal that predates the state, right? That is older than the Civil War. And in it, you can find stories about Iowa and Iowans that most people don't ever know. And there are ones by, Bruce Fenn, who wrote about the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers. You can read about the Helen Lemme Book Club. You can read about the Book Lovers Club in Des Moines. Like, there are just so many rich stories. Richard Breaux wrote about the Black students' experience at the University of Iowa in the 1920s, and Lulu Merle Johnson, our county's namesake. So there are so many good stories about the Midwest, about Iowa, and about Black people's experiences. All you have to do is a quick search for them.
Finally, are there any upcoming events you'd like to shout out? I hear you're hosting a lecture at the Women's Archive soon?
Yes, that's correct. I will be on Wednesday, the 12th. I will be at, is that correct, or is it the 11th?
The 11th.
I will be Wednesday, the 11th at 4:30, giving a lecture of finding Black joy in the Iowa Women's Archive, which will be at the Iowa City Public Library. It'll be great. It'll be some of the wonderful things that I found in our own fantastic archive. And yeah, that's coming up this Wednesday.
I think that's all we have. Ashley, thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us today. Special thanks to Riker and Will behind the camera for their help.
Thank you so much for having me.
This has been a KRUI production. Thank you for listening.